tips that could fit in 10 minutes were related to React and Redux and not really Node package management, although I'd be happy to talk about that with anybody later on. So I have 5 tips for you. My name's Eleni Chappen. I work at 20 Spokes with Aji. I've been working in React and Redux and React Native for a few years now, and there are a few things I've noticed people early to React and Redux doing that I think we can clarify to decrease complexity. So, getting right into React. One of the biggest things to remember is that React is JavaScript. It's not like a lot of other JavaScript tooling like Angular or Ember where you feel like you're learning a big DSL. A lot of the hang-ups when I was learning React were really just centered around learning JavaScript fundamental concepts. An area of React where I think this comes up a lot, if you're familiar with it at all, is binding functions in a component constructor. So this is something you'll see a lot. It's in the React documentation, and it's in a lot of React tutorials that you'll encounter. You'll define a function somewhere in a React component, and then you'll bind it to the context of that component. And I see a lot of people doing this to every component they define in a function without understanding why. So as quickly as I can do it, I'll kind of run down why this is important and why we do it. React.component is just an ES6 class, a JavaScript class. ES6 classes, JavaScript isn't an object-oriented language. It's really just syntactic sugar for regular JavaScript prototypal inheritance. Class functions are not bound to the class context by default. So when we pass functions as props, which is how we pass functionality between React components, they lose their original context. So if you're trying to use like this set state or this props within a function, it's not going to know what those things are because those are associated to the component. We can bind functions to their intended context in a few ways. One is using .bind like we saw before. Another way is using arrow functions. In ES6, when you use an arrow function, it automatically binds that function to whatever context it's defined in. So in this case, if you're defining that function in the component, it's already bound to its component. So using an arrow function in a component, you don't have to expose the constructor at all. You can just use the arrow function. Second tip, components can render null, and that's okay. So in React, we have what are called components, which is how we encapsulate markup on the page. And components have to render something. They can't just return undefined. But as a result, I see a lot of people rendering empty divs. You don't have to do that. You can just render null. So this is a common pattern we see in React a lot. You might have a container component of some sort that's handling the rendering logic of subcomponents. An example of a component that could render null is an error messages component. Use it in a form of some kind. If you have any errors, it'll render them. If not, it'll just render null. And this is nice because it allows our container components to be simply containers. I can move these subcomponents in and out of the container with ease without changing the logic to any of them. And I'm just passing the props and letting the component do the work. So again, why render null? You can change your component's logic in one place. Simplifies container components to be just containers. Third tip, use prop types. React has a way of type checking your props through a package called prop types. It used to be part of React itself, but now it's an independent package that you have to include independently of React. An example of using prop types is like importing prop types from prop types, the separate package. Using our error message component from before, I can declare errors as an array that's required, or I can declare errors as an array of strings that's required. And what's nice about this is that it gives you better debugging messages. It'll warn you when a prop type is required but isn't found, or if it's of a different type that you're expecting. And it also serves as better documentation for components. A lot of times I have to look up examples of how components are used in projects to understand how they're used, but this way I can just read the component, read the prop types, and get a good sense of what that component is and does. My next tips are related to Redux, but they could really be related to any kind of application state management, which is pretty popular in JavaScript apps these days, whether it's like Flux or MobX. It's really helpful to think about app state as a giant global variable. Server-side languages like Ruby or Python, globals are to be avoided, they're a little scary. You should treat app state with the same kind of care. So there are pros and cons associated with adding data to app state. You'll notice these lists are the same. So it really depends on what type of data you're keeping in your app state, which determines whether these things are pros or cons. These are general rules, but they of course can be broken, but this is just what I found. Data that's appropriate for app state, user session data, data that needs to be cached, data shared between verticals of the app, where you don't need to put different app verticals under the same component in order for them to have the same props. Inappropriate for app state, form data. Form data is inherently ephemeral and should be wiped away when components and mount. Any UI-related data, like whether to show or hide a modal or something, and any derived data. A good rule of thumb I use is use component state first and then port to app state when necessary. Redux isn't really an either-or thing. Like, it's not like you have to put all of your data in Redux or none of it. You can really pick or choose what you want to put in there. So app state isn't a database, but it has a lot of the same concerns. They store data, they're queried for data, and their data structure can affect the rest of your app structure. So if you're working, let's say, in a Ruby project, your models and tables really can affect how the rest of the app is done, and it's the same with app state. And again, storing duplicate or derived data can add a lot of complexity. So what they don't have in common is strong data type enforcement. In databases, if you try to add an integer to a string column, it'll throw an error. But in app state, really anything can be anything. To help with that, there are certain packages like Immutable.js or TypeScript that can help enforce strong typing. This last one I want to show is because I see this common pattern a lot in Redux, where we have a lot of arrays of objects with IDs. If you have IDs, you can treat them like IDs and just create a giant object. This causes for better record lookup and better record updating in your store. And if you need an order of some kind that the array was providing, you can add an order of IDs. So again, it does serve kind of a database purpose, your app state, where you need to find records fastly or quickly and update those records. So that's my summary. You can find me at Chappen on Twitter. You can find me at 20 Spokes on Twitter, and shameless plug, we're hiring, so if that's of interest to you, come see me.